button. And with that, I will just do an official welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Felika Ahastin Bryant. I'm the director of the Native American Educational and Cultural Center here at Purdue University. And we're very pleased to host our lunchtime presentation this spring semester. We have been focusing on the tribal nations connection to Indiana. So we have already had presentations from the Myaamia tribe as well as the Potawatomi tribe. So we're very pleased and honored to have Chief Ben Barnes from the Shawnee tribe joining us here from Oklahoma. And we are going to have, we have another guest who will be joining us a little later to provide some additional comments. But with that, I'm going to officially turn it over to Chief Barnes. So we'll give you the floor and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Felika. It's been a long time. I wish I was able to be up there with you all. I think the last time I was there has been a good many years ago. And I want to think that my daughter had not quite, she was not in college yet, and she was looking at Purdue as a university to attend engineering. She wanted to be a Boilermaker, and she attended. We went up there, and also we had the opportunity to attend as in my capacity as second chief at the time. I was honored to meet Felika. Of course, I've known Dr. Marsh for a good many years, but we also had Billy Mills was present, and so it's been a rather long time, and I need to get back to Purdue rather quickly, COVID allowing.
Yeah, was this your daughter Ariel, if I'm correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Good.
Yeah. So she subsequently ended up with a degree in aerospace engineering, and now she's had several years of her career has already passed behind her. She's that's in the rearview mirror. She has worked for Boeing, and now she's at Northrop Grumman, and this year they're expecting their first child. So,
oh, good! Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah, I'm very excited. So, yeah, I'm gonna be a grandpa once again. So, but it was we had been to West Lafayette before because of the proximity that it has to Battleground, Indiana, and Battleground, Indiana, as maybe some don't know, was Prophetstown, where Tenskwatawa, the brother of Tecumseh, had his town where he had received instruction, and the instruction he believed came from a spiritual place, of a return to traditional ways of worship and traditional ways of being, and that resonated with a lot of people from a lot of different communities. And so there were tribal nations from all over the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley started to, people that message resonated with, started to arrive in Prophetstown. And so you had this very intercultural, multicultural community. So right there, just, due east of y'all, is perhaps one of the more sacred places for Shawnee people, where this is one of the city of the prophet. And I know the prophet's been used in the 19th century, perhaps was assigned pejoratively and to insinuate that Tenskwatawa was some sort of bad visionary or antichrist type of stink they wanted to attach to his name. But there's been subsequent scholarship, it's even ongoing now, that shows that it's the narrative of him being a falling out drunk and falling into a fire was a complete fiction that was developed much later in the 1880s. So as much, so this story that people had told came out of a period in time that you have to look at what's going on in the United States generally around 1880s, which is a retelling of history. I think in a new book by Katrina Phillips, she described in Staging Indigeneity, she describes it as faux-stalgia. I really like her word that she created, faux-stalgia, this fake feeling of how the past ought to feel, so that somehow justifies how Indian people were treated during that period of time and prior. So I really like that particular word, but in context to Tenskwatawa, that was very much done to try to religious movements are oftentimes look through a presentist lens, and people don't understand, or they think that it is some sort of character deficiency that was present in that person, where from a Shawnee perspective, from a cultural and traditional perspective, the idea that Tenskwatawa was calling on was just calling people back to participate in their culture, to do things in the way that they were given. There was no need to adopt European manners of being when you could simply just be a Shawnee or be a Ho-Chunk or be whatever it was that you know was your people. That was given to us, and well, that was enough, and it should be enough. So that's our connection with that little piece of real estate that that Purdue occupies. As for myself, of course, Flick introduced that I'm obviously the chief of the Shawnee tribe, but there are 3 Shawnee sovereigns: the absentee Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma, and they're located in just east of Oklahoma City. There's the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma, and today with us, I believe somewhere in the chat room, is Brett Barnes. He is a language instructor for the Eastern Shawnee. He is also my relative. His father and my father are brothers. So in Shawnee's ways, that actually Brett would be my older brother because he's 6 years older than me, and I'll always remind him of that. I was 10 years old. We went fishing, and I remember we had to turn around the car and go buy him a fishing license because he had just turned 16. So, but he's here today with us, and he teaches language. And I have a little brother. So my youngest brother also teaches language, and he teaches language here for the Shawnee tribe. So he's been doing that for a few years. And one thing that the 3 of us all have in common, even before working for our tribes, or in my case, being a political officer for the tribe, we've always been involved in our traditional community. That traditional community resides in a specific place. For those of you that may understand the world from a Western or European type of perspective, there is an axis mundi for Shawnee people, the center of our world. There's one place in Oklahoma that our religious activities can occur. That moves with us. And so when we arrived in Oklahoma, that came with us. And now that has a central spot on the landscape. And Brett, Joel, myself, and perhaps a few hundred other Shawnees still practice that ancient religion that Tenskwatawa told us to observe and maintain. So the promise that Tenskwatawa asked of Shawnee people, we still hear that call to to uphold our culture and religion, and we're part of that traditional community. So even after Brett no longer works at Eastern Shawnee, when Joel no longer works for the tribe as a language teacher, and when someday I no longer occupy the office of the chief of Shawnee, what will never change is we'll always be members of that traditional community. And coming from a traditional cultural framework has always informed my values, but also now I find myself in the office of the chief, and now it frames my ideas on what policy should look like. So conversations that we have as a tribe, as an organization, as a government, we are a sovereign government. For folks that don't understand, the seat that I now hold is the descendant seat of the government of the Shawnee people. At one time, this seat was occupied by Blackhoof when he engaged in diplomatic processes on behalf of Shawnee people with the United States. Chiefs prior to him negotiated treaties with the Republic of Texas, Mexico, France, England, Spain, and ultimately the United States. So, collectives of people of ethnicities don't engage in treaty making. So you can collect people together of an ethnicity, and they don't engage in treaty making. Under international law, that does not make them a sovereign. But whenever those agreements are being ratified under international law, and international law recognizes the transfer of land from one sovereign to another, and just by definition, that's an act of 2 sovereigns engaging. And so our government still continues to this day. And some of the things now that I've come into the seat that I hold, the responsibility that I hold, is to reflect upon the past, reflect upon what Tenskwatawa wanted for Shawnee people, to reflect upon the Shawnees that self-removed prior to westward expansion and came into southeast Missouri, or to the Cornstalks and Blackhoofs and all the others that came before, and to reflect upon what was the vision that those folks had for Shawnee people, and how does culture inform those decisions. A good friend of mine, and oftentimes confidant, he is he is a judge of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And I mentioned them because I'm sure we're going to segue into some Muskogee Creek issues here in a minute when we talk about McGirt. But he's also a member of a traditional community inside the sovereign the Muskogee Creek Nation. He's actually a Yuchi, which is part of the Muskogee Confederacy. He asked the question of me once, and it stuck with me. What's the point of having a tribal court or having a tribal government that is just a mere reflection or is modeled after a state, local, or federal government? Should it not reflect the values of the people? Should the way you build your courts not reflect the intentions of what Shawnee is in the minds of Shawnee people? So it's not enough just to have our own court. It's not enough to have our own governmental processes. But the philosophies that Shawnee people have that are dissimilar from the dominant society, but also dissimilar from our brothers and sisters in Indian country. How do we incorporate those? So those conversations are new to us as we find a way forward, as we reorganize our court, as we build up our government, as we respond to the needs of our people during the time of a global pandemic. So the conversations that are ongoing inside of our community have started out small, but now that community is starting to grow, where more and more of us are coming together and asking these questions about, what does it mean to be Shawnee? What are the pillars? What are the pillars of Shawnee? What are those elements that if you were to take them away, you no longer are Shawnee? So I want to dissect that for a minute. So, because maybe it doesn't make sense, but let's say you have a sandwich and you're going to take away, you're like, what do I take away? I no longer have a sandwich. Well, I take away the bread, I take away the lettuce, I take away the meat, take away the mustard. Well, you no longer have a sandwich. So what is the core philosophical and cultural ideas that are the cornerstones of being a Shawnee person? So those conversations are important, and they're not a conversation that I can have. First of all, I'm not that smart, and I'm not smart enough to make that decision, nor wise enough to make that decision on my own. So part of what we've been doing at the Shawnee Tribe, and it's actually an output of some of the things that we're doing in language, is being able to start having conversations at a side table. So participants in there that you can start to get a feel for the people that are having I don't want to say a deeper thought, but are having a bit of a moment of reflection and asking perhaps some more pointed questions about what it means to be us. And so those conversations are occurring. And one of the goals, at least for my administration, in the time that I'm here in this office, is to try to create a sense of community inside the tribe, where people can have, where we facilitate those conversations and can come together and talk about those things in new ways. Ironically, COVID has helped that. I mean, here we are today on Zoom. So now with the language class, our language class was the first to adopt Zoom because they can no longer meet in person to have classes. And, Zoom is the new paradigm for meeting spaces. I think, for Felica, for everybody else that tries to organize meetings, you didn't have to pay anybody's travel. You didn't have to put up in a hotel. You didn't have to pick them up at the airport. This is the way we're going to do stuff going forward. I'm certain of it, whether it's a cultural center, a museum, or a native program or university. I think, this is just too easy to communicate with each other and get people that have like mind in the same space. And so now we're utilizing that as it's an accident of COVID. So that's been really interesting. And so the conversations that are coming out of that are ongoing. They're also personal and they're also private. And I mean, when I say that, I said I'm not saying that they belong to individuals. I'm saying that there's a different concept within our community that the individual personal rights you hold are actually subordinate to the rights of the community, that the community has intellectual property rights to certain things that no one person can claim as their own. So these ideas of culture and religion and language do not belong to an individual. They belong to the community, and that you cannot do anything with that without having the community involved. So this leads to further conversations about intellectual property rights. How do we protect intellectual property rights of not just the tribe, but also of the culture, language, and religion? And what does that mean under US law? And what does that mean for how we develop forward-looking policies when we're talking about the establishment of new laws within the court system, our court system, also what we do at a legislative and lobbying level, where we start demanding that the intellectual property rights of Indigenous people be respected in U.S. courts, U.S. and state courts. What place does Indigenous people have within the World Intellectual Property Organization? What mechanisms can we claim under international law? Since we are, in fact, an international being that have our roots in international law as how we are recognized, then we have a place to demand intellectual property protection under international law. So when you see the peoples of the Pacific Northwest and their patterns being stolen by fashion houses of France and Italy and Japan and other countries, that's their intellectual property right. So they should be protected under international law. And so too it is with our thing, what we do, how we worship. That belongs in one place. It doesn't travel. It has to stay, it has to be done by a certain group of people. And that group of people sits inside the foundation of who we are as a governmental body. And the governmental body exists to serve those communities. So it's perhaps a different perception from the dominant society that your individual rights are subordinate to community rights. That's a different conversation. And if those things are true, how does that change our understanding of law? How does it change our policy making? How does it change the things that we put in place for the benefit of Shawnee people? And recently, I segued back to the Muskogees and their McGirt decision, where I think one of the more interesting things that has developed in the last year has been the reaffirmation of the Muskogee Creek Nation reservation boundary in Oklahoma. So the Muskogee Creek Nation, Oklahoma has always contended that their reservation no longer existed because it was allotted out to individuals, and that allotment process by nature is a definition of the extinguishing of the reservation. Well, that's not entirely true. Not all of it was allotted out. So if not all of it is allotted out, and if Congress never explicitly stated that the reservation didn't exist, the McGirt case said, well, Congress never took an explicit action. And without that explicit action, the Muskogee Creek Nation reservation still exists. So much of Tulsa today lies inside the Muskogee Creek Nation. So there are new questions that are arising. Who has the authority to regulate inside? Who has the authority for regulation such as taxes and law enforcement inside of the Muskogee Creek Nation? Is it Oklahoma or is it the Muskogee Creek Nations? Well, in terms of law enforcement, that particular question was answered in the McGirt case. The federal government and the Muskogee Creek Nation have authority over Indian offenses, which means that there was an Indian victim or an Indian perpetrator within the Muskogee Creek Nation, as long as it is not one of the major crimes as defined in the Major Crimes Act. So this is new. So Oklahoma's a little scrambling. Some of the people in the law enforcement are in the law enforcement profession are running around like Chicken Little from the children's books. The sky is falling. And Oklahoma's always had cross deputizations. So, or I shouldn't say always. We've had cross deputizations for a couple decades, where civil authorities, police officers from municipalities and counties would enter into cross deputization agreements with the tribal nation. And so our law enforcement officers and city and county law enforcement officers can go back and forth on each other's jurisdictions and exercise the authority. But what McGirt says is McGirt changes a little bit, says, no, we're going to go a step further. And now that these crimes of Indian offense now go to the Muskogee Creek Nation court, or when it's severe enough, should be warranted to go to a federal court, that Oklahoma has no place as a state court in trying these cases. So Oklahoma's finding its way through that. There's other things that are going to be really interesting, like who has the authority to regulate? So when you go in and buy cigarettes, you buy fireworks, those things require some sort of license from the state in order to sell them legally. And so does the Muskogee Creek Nation have that power? Does the Muskogee Creek Nation have the power of taxation? So these are going to be really interesting questions that are going to be unpacked in Oklahoma. And for Shawnee people, we came into Oklahoma late. So we came into Oklahoma in the latter period. We have a treaty with the Cherokee Nation, a treaty of 1854, that guarantees Shawnees and Delaware's citizenship within the Cherokee Nation. So Shawnee people, Delaware people also have a treaty between nations, between the Cherokee and the Shawnee and Delaware, and we can be citizens within the Cherokee Nation. And this is because I think, and perhaps, Professor Marsh, she's the historian, I think Shawnees and Delawares may have been some of the last to come to Oklahoma. Perhaps the Modocs were after us, I'm not sure. But originally, prior to that, we had reservations, both of us had a reservation in Kansas. So what does McGirt mean for Shawnees and Delawares that are coming out of another state? What does it mean by our jurisdictions in those states that Congress, in its laziness, failed to address explicitly? How does it impact other areas of our interest when the Shawnees also had a treaty with the Kingdom of Spain? So Spain gave us a lease on land under treaty in southeast Missouri. What does it mean for that? Because that treaty also passed to the French and later via the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. So if the Spanish lease and treaty passed from Spain to France, then one can infer it thereby also passed to the United States. So there's some really interesting legal questions that Shawnees get to unpack. It's a really interesting time to be chief of the Shawnees. I became chief in September of 2019. I thought, oh, this is gonna be great. I get to travel places like Purdue, get to hang out with my friends in Bloomington, get to go to DC, get to travel. 3 months later, we're in a global pandemic, and I've only recently been able to occupy my office here in the last month. So yeah, it's been a trying time. It has been really interesting. So I do want to have this, that's kind of the backstory of who I am, what I do. And I know we have some really smart people in the room that have some questions, and perhaps even a historical fact correction from Professor Marsh.
I'm not going to correct you on anything, Ben.
Well, am I right? Who was the last to get to Oklahoma?
Yeah,
do you know?
You are. I think the Modoc, actually. I mean, I'd have to look that up myself, but I think they're one of the latest people to be resettled there.
That's an intriguing story because that's from the Pacific Coast. So for folks who don't know, they're from like Klamath, the lava beds of Oregon.
Right, Northern California. Right, exactly. Well, I was wondering if you would, I know one of the big things that you were very interested in doing and pursuing was the proliferation of fake Shawnees and fake Indians in Indiana and Ohio and other places as well. Because I mean, one of the big problems here, other than the Pokagon Potawatomi with land, there are no federally recognized nations in Indiana. And there's been a lot of erasure of that history because of that, right? So if you could comment, because it's still a major problem where state governments will turn to fake Shawnee, right, to have them do official things and historic things. So, and if you could comment on that for some of the viewers here. It is
even more prevalent than perhaps even you may realize, Dawn. Yeah, it's so insidious. Now it's in federal government. We have chairs of federal agencies that now belong to fictional tribes.
Really?
We have trade organizations that serve Indian country who have executive directors that are from fake created tribes. Oh, and when I say fake or creative tribes, maybe I should make definitions on that.
Yeah.
We're not talking about people that suffered during the termination era. We're talking about whole new creations. In some instances, some of these groups have roots that go back into a deeper period of time. And perhaps, towards some of Don's authorships on Lenape people in places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And on the East Coast, you have these Masonic orders called the Improved Order of Red Men. So Grandpa was a member of the Improved Order of Red Men of the Lenape tribe. And so Grandpa was a shaman of the Improved Order of Red Men of the Lenape tribe. Well, do you remember when you're watching as a kid watching the Flintstones and Fred and Barney went to the water buffalo lodge? That's what it is. These are water buffalo lodges. They were back then, and these guys knew they weren't, even in the idea of the name Improved Order of Red Men was racist, but it was this very American idea of a Masonic tradition. So they took this idea of American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, and the disappearing red men, and they superimposed it over Masonic lodges. So you have those kind of instances that have deep roots. Then you have latter day ones that are born out of a cultural awakening, perhaps of the 60s, where you have people demanding certain rights, and the U.S. acquitting itself of an unjust war, and you have these protests and movements for rights for Black people. There was protests everywhere, and there was this resurgence of indigeneity during that period that really had at its core some of that germ that Tenskwatawa was talking about. So whether it's Wilma Mankiller at Alcatraz, or if it's Russell Means, in the Dakotas, it is still people demanding a return to cultural values and being allowed to do so. Not having to ask permission to have a ceremony, not having the police come over and tell you need to put out that fire because there's a burn ban, not having police stop you on a public easement and say, what are you guys picking? You guys got licenses? It's like, wait a minute, I'm walking on a public easement. I have the right to harvest any of these plants on this public easement, but you're asking me for my ID? Yeah. So these rights are the rights that happen every day. Those are happening last year, year before, and all the way back for the Indian experience in Oklahoma, where people are messing with our ability to practice our traditional religions. So in the 60s, people were saying, this has to end. We have the rights to be us. And, a lot of that, people were participating in those and being welcomed into those societies of red power thinkers. And some of those ideas are attractive, and they should be attractive. What are we talking about? We're talking about brotherhood and sisterhood. We're talking respect for land and water. They should be attractive, but the intellectual property of that belongs to Indian people. So when we have groups that pop up that are enchanted by the words of people like Russell Means or Clyde Bellencourt or even Tenskwatawa, and they find this unnatural affection for those, but they decide that they're going to racially shift. So I think Cersei Sturm, is that her name, Don? Cersei Sturm writes on some racial shifting. And also Phil Deloria does in Playing Indian, and talks a little bit about people deciding that, there's a better way to be Indian. And, if white folks can do a better job of being Indian than Indians can. And so oftentimes even our own people that are involved in cultural revitalization will come across some historical reenactor and that is making a bow or some artifact in the way that they did in the 17th century. And the accusation eventually always comes out. So, well, I'm keeping this tradition alive before you Indians lose it. It's like, really? You're flint napping. You think I give a damn about flint napping? You think my identity is rooted in flint napping? I thought it was rooted in the identity of the Shawnee culture and religion that I still practice, not in flint napping. But there's this misplaced idea. Now we see 501c3s that are also, trying to usurp the place of federally recognized tribes that are coming together, and they may have token representation, within that group where they grab an Indian and poke it in there, and so then they say, well, we're an Indian organization, and now they engage at levels that they shouldn't be in government-to-government consultations, or they insert themselves into processes that are solely reserved for federally recognized tribes, such as NAGPRA negotiations between universities such as yourself and tribal nations, because the ancestral remains that sit there in the departments of anthropology and archaeology, we reserve those rights, and those are solely reserved to us on the disposition and how those things are going to be returned to the earth. They don't belong to an urban Indian organization like you might find in Columbus, Ohio, or elsewhere. So, the issue is huge, and it's not small. In 2011, there was a GAO report, 12-348. That GAO report, the Governmental Accountability Office, issued this report studying what is the federal cost to providing federal funds, just federal funds, not foundation funds from corporations, third parties, or state funds, or even local funds, but just federal funds. And they did an analysis of just 26 of these groups, just 26. They pulled the data on those 26 groups from the years 2007 to 2010. The cost to the American taxpayer was over $100 million. just 26 groups. The Cherokee Nation right now has well over 400. Some have estimated as many as 800 fake Cherokee groups. The Shawnee tribe has scores of groups. There, at one time, we had about 80. I have been very vocal in my opposition to this group. Some of these groups have been stamped out, but it's also like stomping on Jello. Little pieces of Jello go all over the room, and you really didn't stamp it out. So they just kind of fracture and become smaller units of themselves. So we have seen some of these groups diminished. But one of the things that we've really seen that's been troubling is the amount of Lenape groups that have grown. So the Delaware tribe has seen a resurgence of Lenape groups where people are claiming to be Lenape, and no one even applies academic rigor to their claims. And if any academic rigor was applied at all, you'd find out they were complete fictions, or you'd find out that Grandpa was a member of the Improved Order of Red Men. So it's a real problem. It's a long answer to a very brief question.
Well, just one other thing really quickly then. If there is no, is there any website or list or any organization where you know, because that's the thing. It's like if people don't know and they don't even know how to ask, like some group in like Tippecanoe County, right? And they have the Feast of the Hunter's Moon and they say, oh, we have authentic Indians showing us how people lived at Fort Wyattanabe. And if I can say, hey, they're not, here's how you go to find out, that's part of the issue. So
I think people want, and this, here I was touting her book. I just got this book like just a week ago. I love this book, but this staging indigeneity goes to your question. People want us in a particular way, Don. They want us as performance set pieces. They want Indian people as performance set pieces.
Yes.
When in fact, what are Indian clothes? This little cheap blue polo I'm wearing today is my today's Indian clothes.
Right.
The only outward semblance that I have today of being Indian at all, perhaps, is this little beaded lanyard for my Prox card. And yeah, I grew my hair out, but that's because, before I lose it, I want to have some for a while. So that's the only indicators. You don't have to do anything to be Indian, but they want their Indianness in a performative way. And this has been going on for such a long time. She goes into great analysis of what Galloway did with Thomas Alford, and how he brought Thomas Alford back to Ohio at the turn of the century. And he was quite literally Galloway's monkey on a leash. So he paraded this Indian about town, like a monkey on a leash, like he was a zookeeper.
Right.
And so, it's a great volume if anybody wants to read it.
Right.
Still provoking new thoughts for me.
Right. Thank you.
There's a site. I'm digging it up right now, and I'm going to share it in chat if someone will give me the permissions on where you can go. This is a federal site, actually, and they maintain this, and they update it, and they even will update like a list of the tribal leaders on who to contact. So let's say someone in anthropology, archaeology, or the Purdue NAGPR coordinator wants to get hold of a tribal nation. This is where they go to find that listing. So, and while I'm doing this, someone else can ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, this is Falika really quick. I'm sorry, I had somebody here. I had to step away from the presentation for a while. I do want to give, we do have another guest that I'd like to just see if Brett Barnes would be able to join us just for a bit. We had some confusion, so I apologize for the confusion, and we'll definitely invite Brett Barnes to join us. He's the language director for the Eastern Shawnee tribe. And I just want to give him a couple of minutes. If you'd like to offer any type of comments, Brett, you're welcome to do so while Chief Barnes is working on his comments there. And I was actually writing in, so Dawn beat me to it. She was writing in the title of the book, and I was getting ready to post it as well. So I've had a couple of comments asking what is the name of the book. So thanks, Dawn, for adding that for us. Okay, but if you'd like to, if you're okay, then we'll have Barnes ask some. Oh, he's unmuting himself. So go ahead. We'll give you a couple of minutes to offer some comments.
I really don't feel like there's anything that needs to be added to what Ben has already said. He's captured so much, so many talking points, and I don't even think that I've ever witnessed anybody capture that many talking points, hit so many nails right on the head.
At first, I thought you was going to poke fun at me, Buzz. I appreciate that. Sounds like a compliment, but I'm waiting for the other shoe, Brett. For those that don't know me, he's my relative. He and I
Well, I'm
are
probably
first
going to
cousins.
disappoint you this time because I don't have any kind of criticism to offer. In fact, some of what you said is beyond my intellect, beyond my scholastic capabilities. And I'm proud to hear my younger cousin being able to explain so much that you've explained to people that need to understand what this world looks like from our perspective. And I know that sounds arrogant, that sounds conceited, but it's just the world that we've had to tolerate, the world we've had to, I guess, adapt to. And to explain that to people who's not been inside of our circle, that's a difficult thing to accomplish. And I feel like you've been on target here, and I'd like to explain that part of it. I think that's, quite a dynamic to even satisfy. It is complicated, and I can't even think of a word to describe it, but there's so many issues overlapping with so many other issues. They're intertwined, they're overlapped. And I don't even think that any human is capable of explaining it to somebody who has not experienced it, felt the impact of it, and then tried to live in both worlds like we've had to do based on what has been done to our people, through removal, through allotment acts. And, it's hard to even discuss one of those topics without overlapping and getting sidetracked and, getting off into a rabbit hole. Is that the word they use? Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling here, but I just want to say that I agree with virtually everything that you've said. And I hope that these folks will ask some questions, and I'll do my best to help you answer some of those questions. But I think this is a good opportunity to plant that seed. I don't even know who all is on the call, but I think this is something that needs to be heard by those people who have a relationship with our community. So I'm going to stop right there.
If I could, I think the closest I've ever come to understanding the impossibility of being able to understand the situation, and I confess that I still will never know it fully, is last year, actually 1 year Saturday, it'll be 1 year Saturday, that I had a brand new grandson that was born. And he was 2 pounds. And of course, so we were so worried about the new grandson because he was so small, so fragile, and had so many problems. And we were in the middle of the George Floyd moment. And I had never understood completely. I could never feel completely what that meant for Black people. My grandson's Black. I'm going to have a conversation one day about how he should act when he drives a car, about how he should be careful if he runs down the street, about how when he's in certain places, when he leaves a convenience store, what to look for. I've never had to do that. And so I'll never know what that's like, but I never had to consider it. I never had to consider that until he was born. So for Indian people, we still have these things, to see our people made as pantomimes or to be consumed as a caricature, and to have the caricature actually preferred. We have some really deep philosophical conversations going on here in Indian country, yet people want the feast of the hunter's moon. That's what they'd rather have.
Okay, so if we have, I just put a note in the chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And I apologize, I have somebody with IT upstairs in the computer lab, and I have somebody here working on the door as well. So I'm going to put myself on mute in case there's some banging around, but please feel free to offer some comments in your chat, or if you have any questions. Let me see. Oh, go ahead, Dawn.
Okay, I don't mean to hog up this whole thing, but until there's another questionnaire. Something else, I'm actually working on an article about how Indiana failed to respond to NAGPRA laws. So how's your work? I mean, how's it been working with the state of Indiana relative to repatriation and NAGPRA issues in general? Because they've had some humongous cases here, you know, that have just, I mean, it's been national and international news. So
Yeah,
how's it been for you guys?
I'll let you maybe give some background information on Strawtown and what happened there. That was relatively recently. I think
Right.
some of the problems, from, as I see it, is are structural in the way that universities are structured, in the fact that oftentimes the siloization that occurs in your universities, that it abhors interdisciplinary conversations or interdisciplinary participation with each other, and sometimes even between campuses. So if IUPUI or Purdue Fort Wayne or someone, you know, they may not ever even have the intercommunication between the different buildings. And so I think, you know, there's some structural problems, but also there's some, because of the lack of Indian people in Indiana, there's also there's a lack of understanding. Like when we want to do a repatriation and they want to put it under the cemetery law, it's like, really?
Right.
Got 6,000-year-old bones, and you want me to abide by laws that are actually governing how the undertaker embalms a body? It's like 6,000-year-old remains. You know, they're almost ossified at this point. You know, so it is a struggle. And I have made a joke to Chief Wallace. I'll say this, you know, she's not here. She knows I say it oftentimes, you know.
Right.
It's like, Chief, there needs to be more of us, because, you know, you take Ohio, I'll work on Indiana, and then when we're done, we'll move to Tennessee and Kentucky, you know. And so, you know, we're still both working on Ohio and Indiana, you know. I don't think and, you know, I've largely just been spending a lot of time at Indiana. I just there's not enough hours in the day. When I say Indiana, I mean IU, Bloomington. I know it's your Big Ten rival, interstate rival.
I got nothing. I don't care.
Yeah. So anyway, I spent a lot of time down there, but that's it's because actually we found a gap. There was a chink in the armor, and the Glenn Black Lab actually had a tremendous number of human bodies.
Right. Exactly.
Like the 6th largest in the nation, I believe. And so the chink in the armor was actually an individual named April Sievert. She came to Oklahoma, threw herself on the sword with mea culpa. You know, she became the director. She didn't do it. She wasn't the director of GBL, but she knew there was a better way. So now it's from, you know, finding individuals and then finding a way to take that individual relationship and then build it between the institution. So it's no longer, you know, Ben and April are buddies and friends, we hug when we see each other, but the Shawnee tribe and now Indiana have a relationship.
Right.
So to take that relationship from Ben and April are buddies to the Shawnee tribe in Indiana are working towards something.
Right.
And I would ask you to hold your breath for a few more weeks, and you're going to hear some news out of the Big Ten that will go towards Dawn's question. Wait for May 1st.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll be listening for that. Thanks, Ben.
And if I could plug one more book, and perhaps the most important book. This book right here, inside this thin little booklet, are most of the solutions to Indian people's problems. The issues that we have are inherent human rights problems. And so it's funny that the simple concepts in such a skinny little book address all the issues that Indian people suffer. And the solution is simple. It's inherent human rights. That's all Indian people are asking for.
Okay, I do have one question that came through, and it says, is there any movement in Indiana towards recognizing or appropriating land for Indigenous people?
Oh, and I see it's in reference specifically to the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act was passed after the removal of Eastern peoples. So the Trail of Tears and Indian removal did not just affect the American Southeast. So despite the exhibit at the NMAI in DC, it did not just affect the Cherokees and Choctaws. So it's actually a vast swath of the eastern US, and that removal predated the Morrill Act. So land grant universities, largely the foundational monies that benefited Purdue, benefited Ohio State, and that's the two that I remember offhand. Those did not come from Shawnee lands. The Shawnee lands were the way that the Morrill Act was dealing with other tribes west after the passage of the 1831 Removal Act. Now, have we been successfully able to argue for free tuition at universities and tuitions? You'd think that would be an easy ask, especially when I have said this in Indiana, so I will continue to pick on Indiana. Also, I feel like I had the best relationship with Indiana. So, you know, hopefully friends can pick on each other. Indiana was home to Erminy Wheeler Vogelin and Carl Vogelin. Carl Vogelin was probably one of the most preeminent linguists in the United States from 1930 to 1950. And his scholarship on language was top notch. Top notch. The guy had an impressive ear. But even more impressive than Carl Vogelin and his linguistic research was his wife at the time, Erminy Wheeler Vogelin. The woman was a juggernaut. You know, she founded the discipline of ethnohistory, and she, I believe, stole Eli Lilly's triangulative research principles that he used to develop insulin drugs in his factories. She used those methods to ask questions of Indian people. And at the time, Charles Vogelin and Erminy Wheeler Vogelin were being paid by Eli Lilly to go out and find the backstory to the Wallamolam, which is a fiction. It's a fiction. It's a ruse. It's not a real thing. But they believed that it was some sort of great origin story that the Delaware people had told. So Carl Vogelin, at the outset of that project and the funding from Eli Lilly, was if there was any existing people that may have any knowledge of the Wallamolam and the story that it told, it likely survives amongst the Shawnee. So for a generation, no, actually for 2 generations, because he actually did this up into the 70s. He worked on Shawnee language and he worked with Shawnee speakers. And so I would argue that perhaps the most documented Algonquian language in the United States came out of the Shawnees. Our travels, our histories may be some of the best documented in all of North America. And that repository, there is the trifecta, a troika of Shawnee documents, largely. You have them at the American Philosophical Society, a non-university in Philadelphia. You have them at the Newberry Research Library in Chicago, also not a university. And you have them at IU, in the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley Ethnohistory Collection, in some of the letters and papers of Erminy Wheeler and Carl Vogelin that still exist at those that are not at the Newberry or the APS. Also within the ASRI and some of the works that ASRI did at Indiana University. So you have all these documents at IU. How many undergraduate degrees? How many master's degrees? How many PhDs were created on the body of knowledge that Shawnees provided to IU? How many Shawnees actually graduated and got to use that material, bring it back into their communities, and rebuild the communities that were decimated during that period of time, period of termination, period of extinction? Quite literally a pogrom. A pogrom was committed upon our people. Did we get to access that information to renew our people, to renew our communities? Have we been allowed to use it? What stands in the way of our people to be able to touch that material? Out-of-state tuition. We're not an out-of-state people. Everything east of the United States, we traveled freely amongst. It's not our fault that we buried our ancestors in the soil that was Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, and elsewhere. Now those human remains have launched the careers of how many anthropologists and archaeologists? What debt does universities have to Shawnee people? How do we get to go back to those places and use those to revivify what it means to be Shawnee? So the conversations are ongoing. Are there places that do the job better? Yes. And I point this out to everybody in the Big Ten. Iowa's already doing it. If you're from one of the historic tribes of Iowa, guess what? In-state tuition. Michigan already does it. And this is not just something, this is not just, me throwing stones at Indiana. It's also Pennsylvania. It's also Ohio State. If any of you follow me on Facebook, you saw me rant and rail on Ohio State just last week. They're dotting the I in indigeneity, and they forgot to include the Miamis, Shawnees, and Delawares. It's like, really? How are you dotting the I in indigeneity? And I'm talking to people that called it home. So Indian people are neglected, and it's neglected. All those careers that were launched off, quite literally, the bones of our people. That debt's not been paid.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. It's already 12:57. Time flies by when you're sharing lots of good information. So I want to go ahead and end up closing, and just in case we need to, if there's anybody needs to get to their next appointment. But thank you so much for joining us, Chief Barnes. I'm going to just formally thank you, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future. So with that, I'm going to ask if we can have Deb just go ahead and officially stop recording so we can, we'll